Hi, friends. My name's Host Eric, and I'm the host of Talking with Famous People. And I thought I'd explain what's wrong with this common argument that you hear. If you've ever argued about God with somebody, whether God exists, if you're a Christian, if you've argued with an atheist, if you're an atheist and you argue with a Christian, you may have come across this argument. There's a lot of other common arguments that are used to justify the existence of God. So before I go any further, let me just state that I'm attending this thing to this as a debate coach and explaining why it doesn't work argumentationally. I am not attending to it as a person with a status regarding religion. If I were, then I'd be arguing a Christian perspective, and that wouldn't include proving God. Because remember, I'm a Christian. That means I have faith. Faith is belief in the absence of evidence or in the face of contrary evidence. If you can prove God, then you have made it unnecessary to have faith. So for people who think it's a good idea to have God validate logically, they are wrong. That is not how one maintains a good relationship with God. So let me explain what's wrong with this argument here now. You see here that it's called the deductive argument from contingency. It's basically a first cause argument. It just changes the word cause to contingent because cause is difficult to define, much more difficult to define than contingency, which doesn't have the issue of overcausality. So contingency means that a given thing supervenes upon something else, okay? And supervene in philosophy talk means if A supervenes on B, then B is necessary before A can come into existence, okay? So remember, in that example, if A supervenes upon B, then A is contingent upon B, and B is necessary for A to exist, okay? That's what they're calling a contingency relationship. Okay, so the argument says here, a contingent being exists. That's to say, you can establish a contingency relationship regarding a being. So, for example, me. I'm contingent upon, or I supervene upon, my parents existing before me and having sex and getting pregnant and stuff like that, right? So you can explain me in terms of contingency. Okay. All contingent beings have a sufficient cause or fully adequate explanation for their existence. In other words, there's nothing that just nobody appears without being born after a man and woman have sex. Okay. The sufficient cause or fully adequate explanation for the existence of contingent beings is something other than the contingent being itself. So nobody creates themselves. The sufficient cause or fully adequate explanation for the existence of contingent beings must either be solely or other contingent beings or include a non-contingent necessary being. All right, so number 4 is saying if the thing that's necessary for the thing that's contingent isn't a contingent being, then it must be a non-contingent being. Well, I mean, the only thing we can actually include is to say if it's not a contingent being, then it must be something else. So you could imagine something having some aspect of, without specifying what it is, something having some aspect of contingency that, along with other aspects of something, that renders it into, just as we can imagine true, false, and no truth value, we can imagine contingent, non-contingent, and no contingency value. Now, it's easy for us to imagine necessary and contingent things because we define each of those relationships when we talk about it. I'll get to dismantling this thing in a second. It's really weak argumentation. Contingent beings alone cannot provide a sufficient cause or full adequate explanation for the existence of contingent beings. Okay, so if in fact my explanation that I supervene upon my parents is not a fully adequate explanation, then you're contradicting right here the idea that must be solely other contingent beings or, or include a non-contingent being. So, what comprises a fully adequate explanation for my existence? I mean, the accurate explanation doesn't include the beginning of the universe. The accurate contingencies are defined as things that necessarily happened before me that made me possible. If we're going to say that I'm contingent on everything in history that happened before me, then we take away the meaning of the word contingency. No, now it's no longer linked to any meaningful causal acts, okay? So, with simple causality, when there's not over causality, you can reduce the cause to something very specific. So, for example, if I push something off of a table and it falls on the floor, I've caused it to fall on the floor. You can also create a bunch of narratives about other factors that may have influenced me choosing to do that. So, however, if you fail to distinguish between things that are contingent and things that are unrelated, in other words, too distant from the outcome to count as contingent, then you strip away from the word contingent any operational meaning. You can't use it to do anything, right? Because what we learn is that all this is really saying is we need an explanation for the universe. That's all it's saying, right? Since we can't understand things except through, we can't understand things' existence except through contingency, we need an explanation for the universe. That's all it's saying with all this stuff here. Therefore, what sufficiently causes or fully adequately explains the existence of contingent beings must include a non-contingent being. I mean, the thing is, that's totally gotten it wrong, right? So contingency, in every contingency we describe, there's a necessary part and there's a contingent part. But we don't describe everything in terms of necessity and contingency. There are lots of other ways to describe things. So, in this case, he's saying, yeah, but when we describe something like this, we have to have two parts. So since we can conclude the universe is contingent, then we must have the other part, the necessary part. And since we don't know what that is, God. Of course, there's no reason to conclude that just because everything we know and observe, we can create a contingency narrative about, that the one thing we can't create a contingency narrative about is necessarily subject to the same status as everything we can create a contingency narrative about. Like, it may be true we don't have a definitive narrative to explain the necessary part upon which the universe was contingent, supposedly. But that makes the universe distinct from everything else. So, in that regard, why wouldn't we conclude maybe the universe isn't contingent? I mean, after all, everything else, we can make some sort of convincing story about the necessary parts. And remember, different parties will always create different stories about what's necessary, because there's a lot. If you include anything in contingency, anything that comes before and is vaguely related, then any given person articulating that relationship of contingency and necessity is creating it for their particular situation for their own purposes, okay? This relationship of contingency and necessity doesn't exist outside of a person creating it for some argumentational reason. So, it might be the case that I can't race in the Daytona 500 until I qualify in race Mia. So you would say my racing in the Daytona 500 is contingent upon my successfully passing the qualification in this other race, okay? But that contingency exists because somebody said words that said, you must do this, and everybody agreed that they had the authority to dictate those terms, you know? It's not like there's something inherently contingent. It's always a mapping act that links two things in time with some sort of causality implications. So we know when we're talking about conditionality that there's a lot of things we can do with conditionality that don't necessarily include things actually happening. What this notion of contingency is trying to do is it's trying to take the aspects of conditionality that are liberated from the law of non-contradiction and attribute them to physical reality. But of course, conditionality doesn't operate like that. If all pigs fly doesn't require that any pigs fly. And what they're trying to say here is that quality of contingency, of conditionality that says any conditional must have an antecedent and a consequent, applies to reality as well, so as to sidestep the rules of causality and pretend as though that quality were implicit to the things being talked about rather than implicit to talking about them, which is incorrect. So, therefore, a necessary being exists. The universe, which is composed of only contingent beings, is contingent. See, like, why? Why would we conclude that, right? Even if it were the case that the universe is comprises only contingent beings, which, I mean, is... if you describe contingency as the fact that things that come after, things that exist or happen or be, always have to have something come before them, then, I mean, yes, time moves forward in a linear fashion. But that's not proof of God, right? So, of course, there's no reason to conclude that even if every single thing within the universe can be described in the contingency necessary relationship, that same rule should apply to the universe as a whole. There's just no reason to. It's just an arbitrary claim, right? So, not everything plays by the same rules. And regardless, all of this notion of contingency is predicated on an agent establishing that relationship between something that is necessary and something that is contingent. And note where it says here, all things in the universe are contingent, or necessary is the correct explanation. All things in the universe are contingent or necessary. So in any given relationship that we're describing, one thing will be the necessary part, one thing will be the contingent part. Can we then change the frame of reference and make the necessary part become the contingent part of something else? Yes, we can. But the correct description of it is anything in the universe that we can talk about, we can describe as either a necessary or contingent element in a relationship with something else. Except the universe. Therefore God. That's inadequate, totally inadequate justification. Completely inadequate. So it's fine to start with observations. So nobody should dispute observation one. A contingent being exists. Okay? That's a perfectly reasonable observation to make. Number two, however, all contingent beings have a sufficient cause or a fully adequate explanation for their existence. The answer is no being or entity or object in the universe has ever received a full explanation of all of its contingencies. So there's absolutely no reason to believe that anything has a fully adequate explanation, let alone everything. After all, we have no example of it. If this fully adequate explanation includes the origin of the universe, then we've never heard it, and there's no reason to believe it exists. There's not a single instance of it. The sufficient cause of or fully adequate explanation for the existence of contingent beings is something other than the contingent being itself. Okay, so the thing is, it's true that things can't be responsible for their own. In other words, you can't be both the necessary part and the contingent part. You have to have two different things. Okay, I'm not going to dispute that observation either, right? That's fair when you're making those distinctions. Remember, all of this stuff is predicated on people making those distinctions. Now, this one, the sufficient cause of or fully adequate explanation for the existence of contingent beings must be either solely other contingent beings or include a non-contingent being. This is a really unnecessary observation. If you're going to point out that all beings are contingent, then you've already missed the boat, right? Because you should be saying all beings, all entities, all objects in the universe can be ascribed the status of necessary or contingent as related to something else, okay? Which is a very different thing than saying everything's contingent. It may be true that you can ascribe that label to everything, but doing so necessitates you describing the label to something else if necessary. So we see those labels aren't permanent to those things, but rather used in argumentation for a reason. So it's of course not necessarily the case that a fully adequate explanation is one that comprises only contingent beings or also include a non-contingent being. Wait, let me see. How do they get to this conclusion? Therefore, what sufficiently causes or fully adequate... Okay, I see. So they're basically saying, and that's that one up there, the sufficient cause or fully adequate explanation for the existence of contingent beings must be solely other contingent beings or include a non-contingent being. And then they say, it's not just contingent beings, therefore it must include a non-contingent being. This word being is an interesting one, right? It's like, we don't have to talk about beings as being contingent. We can talk about a rock being contingent. You know, this rock here is contingent upon the landslide that brought it down here. I mean, it's just such a mess, right? It's really frustrating because I had this big argument with this guy Khalifa earlier. He's trying to say that he's making this argument and that I don't know it because I haven't studied it or something. And then Winston's mom linked to it in Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Of course I understand this argument. Of course I've encountered it a fucking million times before. I brought it up here so that I could show you what their explanation of it is. But it's subject to the same critiques that I made earlier. It's just fundamentally fucking not a good argument, right? It's like, you need to substantiate things meaningfully. Your initial claims are not strong. Like the first one, that you can a contingent being exists, a being such that if it exists, it could have not existed. I mean, the thing is, if it exists, then it didn't not exist. The idea that it could have not existed is only something that happens in the conditional realm, not something that happens in the real world, right? That's a mapping matter. It's not referencing any actual attribute in the world. There's no aspect of me that holds on to the attribute or expresses the self or any of those things. There's no evidence persists of my purported contingency, right? So it's like I could have a being that such that if it exists, it cannot not exist. I mean, what the hell does that mean? Obviously, if a being is A, then it's not A. So a being such that if it exists, it cannot not exist. Therefore, a necessary being A being such that if it exists, it cannot exist exists? What the fuck kind of sentence is that? A being such that if it exists, it cannot not exist. So is that a being that's contingent upon itself? Because didn't we already eliminate the possibility of beings that were contingent on themselves? So in other words, this is a mess. This is word salad. There's no people talk about word salad, right? Khalifa, you are guilty of word salad. Good arguing respects the limits of logic, makes limited claims, doesn't do crazy nonsense like this, right? I mean, this is a very old argument that doesn't make it bad, but if this is the best you can do in terms of trying to establish the existence of God, you really need to listen to my explanations and stuff, like I said in the live stream earlier, which are vastly better than this. Vastly. And the thing is, remember, I'm not trying to prove God because I'm a good Christian, which means I understand it's a matter of faith, which means if I were to prove it, I'd no longer need faith, and therefore I wouldn't have a good relationship with God. It would be with something else. Now, that's how sensible people understand their relationship with God. It's a behavior, not something predicated upon arguments. I don't have to justify anything to pray to God. I don't have to believe he exists or make arguments about that anyway. Those things are not related to my relationship to God, and they shouldn't be related to my relationship to God. I will go so far as to say, if you want to be right about God, you should talk about it the way I do. But also remember, anytime anybody's arguing about God, whether it be this or the clockmaker's analogy or any other kind of argument, your number one job is to define the term you're trying to prove. This is really more of a definition than a proof. It's saying that because we don't have an explanation for the universe, we'll call that God. God as an explanation for the universe doesn't really tell us anything about God, right? So it's like, if we call that thing that is necessary for the universe to exist, which has not been established that contingency quality applies to the whole. Not been established. Maybe it's correct, but it's not been established. Just because we can find the contingent part but not the necessary part doesn't mean there is a necessary part, because it may be the one thing we can't describe by a contingency. I know I've repeated myself a bit here, and I didn't really come up with notes or anything. I just wanted to kind of go through it and explain what's wrong with it, right? There's a lot of things wrong with it, but regardless, I had to ban Khalifa because he didn't listen to what I was saying. You know, it's like, he wanted to make this contingency argument. I was saying, define God first. If you really want to prove something exists, what you need to do is not say, because we don't have an explanation for this, we can call that God and wipe our hands and say we're done. You haven't done anything except define God as the thing that you've established doesn't have a better explanation. So that's not a meaningful proof of God or a meaningful proof of anything. It's just saying there is something about which we don't have an explanation. We might as well call that God. So, I guess that's it. It's really frustrating arguing with people who don't listen to you. So the thing is, Khalifa and I got very frustrated at each other. But the big difference is, I was responding to what he was saying, and he did not listen and respond to what I was saying. So when he said, I define God as free will, point of consciousness, well, that's not a meaningful definition. It just simply isn't. You can't use that definition to do anything. If free will is God, then everybody has God? Or if point of consciousness is God, I mean, what's a point of consciousness? Am I a point of consciousness? It's like, if you're going to try to define something, the words you say as a definition for it, if you're going to want to argue about that thing, need to be words that other people can use to say, yes, this is one of those things, or no, this is not one of those things. So if I define injustice as anything that violates rights, you might say, well, how about this? These people are poor over here. Is that injustice? And according to me, that would not be injustice because I've given you a definition to test it against. Is there explicit rights violations by one individual against another, by one group against a person, or something like that you can point to? If not, then it's not an instance of injustice by my definition. Now, you might not agree with my definition, but you and everybody will appreciate it because you can use it yourself. If that were my definition, you can use it yourself and say, well, you say this is a matter of justice, but this doesn't include any rights violations. And I go, shit, I missed that part, right? Because I've given you a definition you can pin me down with, and you can use it to say, this doesn't uphold under your own definition, Eric, but by your definition, Eric, this and this and this. That's actually communicating with people. To actually communicate with people, you need to give them definitions of things that they can use to establish the statuses that you're trying to utilize in the argumentation you're doing themselves, independently of you. They need to be able to present how your definition impacts. So it's like, for example, when I tried to operationalize, as it's called, that definition that Khalifa gave, which was free will, point of consciousness, my answer was, well, I guess I'm God. I have free will and consciousness and a point. So, I guess, of course, you can't use that definition to do what definitions need to do. That's what definitions are for, is to allow all parties arguing about something to distinguish whether something qualifies as meow or doesn't qualify as meow. And then when you both have your respective frameworks and definitions, and everybody argues their contingents under that, everybody can check against, and we can see maybe you validate best under your own framework, he validates best under his own framework. But maybe I validate best under both frameworks. Maybe he does. Maybe he validates best under my framework, and I validate best under his framework. If we define things properly, we can make determinations like that at the end of the conversation. If we don't, we are just playing pretend baseball. And that's what happened today when I was arguing with Khalifa. That's what this is doing here. Anytime you're arguing about something that is persistently undefined, and talking about the existence or non-existence of it, you are trying to play baseball without a ball. Everybody's sliding, and the guy goes, he's safe. No, he's out. No, he's safe. No, he's out. But they're just pantomiming these motions without a ball. And as a consequence, I'm standing there on the sidelines going, he's neither safe nor out. You guys aren't playing with the ball. In other words, any such conversations about God, the proof thereof, etc., to be meaningful conversations have to be predicated on both parties defining God. Even if they disagree in their definitions, they both need to provide definitions. If they disagree, then they need to argue about which definition is preferable before they begin trying to prove it. Okay? This kind of argument is just saying, like I said, I can prove there's something we don't have a necessary part for when we try to map contingencies. Therefore, God. I mean, all right. Thanks. Bye. Don't forget to eat plenty of cheese.